Have you ever wondered if the God you have always known is really the only one who should be there in Scripture? What if I told you that there is such a powerful, enigmatic African God that even Moses, the great Hebrew leader, feared his presence? A God who not only challenged traditional Bible narratives, but for reasons that may never have been officially explained, has been deliberately deleted from history. Yes, you are about to get into a truth that can turn everything inside out. The Bible hid an African God, an ancestral, living, dreaded, respected spiritual entity who, according to forgotten traditions, humbled Moses in a key time, before disappearing from Scripture as if he had never existed. But why hide a deity of this level? Why silence a spiritual being that appears in much older traditions than the biblical text we know today? Who was this African God? What was your real name? What was your mission? What kind of power did he carry to confront Moises, the same one who received the boards of the law? Why confront it? And why was this being removed, scratched, camouflaged in the later construction of Jewish monotheism? What you will see here is not just another religious interpretation. It is a deep dive in a forbidden, hidden, ancestral territory. You will cross layers of African spirituality buried by centuries of colonization. Will touch spiritual truths that have been treated as a threat. You will realize that there are connections between mystical Egypt, the African gods, and the foundations of Judeo-Christian faith that no one dare to approach in the pulpits or seminars. And perhaps, if you allow this content to talk to your soul and not just your intellect, you leave here with your spiritual perception transformed forever. The urgency is real. Most people have never heard of this God, and many of those who heard, they immediately rejected, because they were trained to see everything that is African spirituality as inferior, pagan, or demonic. But what if this narrative was built exactly to hide the fact that the spiritual roots of humanity are black, deep, and ancestral? What if God's real name was replaced, camouflaged, adapted, and with that, the faith of millions was redirected without realizing it? You need to know that the Bible you have in your hands has gone through human hands. It was translated, retrodated, edited, adapted to religious and political interests. And in this process, a lot has been erased, especially all that referred to the deities prior to the institutional Yahweh. And this is where the mystery intensifies. Why does Moses, created as an Egyptian prince, educated among the most powerful priests of the ancient African world, have a meeting with a divine voice precisely in the desert? And why did this voice come from the fire? Why didn't he see a face, but heard a vague identity? Is it really the Hebrew God who spoke to him? Or was the I Am another entity, an African ancestral deity that did not fit in the new theology that was born? Who has eyes to see will realize that maybe that burning bush hid more than fire. He hid a presence that the story tried to erase, and what you will find out here today is revealing. Who was this mysterious African God, and where he appears, even discreetly, in the sacred texts? What the African oral tradition, kept alive for centuries, reveals about this spiritual confrontation with Moses. Like the Bible, in older versions, it still leaves tracks and clues that have been forgotten, removed, or reinterpreted. Since Egypt was not only the villain of the Hebrew narrative, but the cradle of a deep and transformative spiritual wisdom. What are the archaeological and cultural evidence that supports this revelation? Why this knowledge was censored, considered dangerous, and silenced for generations? The direct spiritual impact that this rediscovery can cause in those who live today under a faith that does not know their origins. How this fact totally changes the way of seeing Moses, the Hebrew people, and the biblical God himself. What are the spiritual parallels between this ancestral God and other figures worshipped by black cultures from the African continent? And finally, what all this has to do with you, because yes, you are part of it. Are you really prepared to open your spiritual eyes and question everything you have taught you about the Bible, the faith, and about God? This video is not just another preaching, it is a crossing. It is a portal for hidden truths, a journey through the forgotten bowels of the spiritual history of humanity. And if you are not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Already leave your like and activates the bell, because what is coming is strong. And I want you to comment below with courage. Have you heard of an African god who challenged Moses? What is intuition saying now? So take a deep breath, because from now on, let's go back to the beginning of everything, to Egypt, to the Black Earth, to the spiritual center of the ancient world, because only when we understand the original context can we clearly see what was hidden. And perhaps only then the truth begins to reveal itself before your eyes. But before we go deeper into this revelation, I want to make you an important invitation. If this theme is already moving your mind and heart, leave your like right now. It shows YouTube that this subject needs to reach more people. And more than that, leave a comment below. Write what you are feeling, if this information resonates with something you had already suspected, or if this is the first time you hear about an related African god. Your comment is an essential part of this journey, because what we are building here is not just a video, it is a search community of the truth. People who refuse to accept the official version without question, who feel that there is something greater, deeper, hidden behind the pages of history and scripture. And if you are not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Because what we will explore next can completely change your vision of the Bible, God, and even your own spiritual identity. Here, each video is a step more towards a greater revelation, and you won't want to lose what comes next. So, comment, leave the like and subscribe, because now together let's go back to the beginning of history, where it all began, in the spiritual heart of Africa. To understand what really happened between Moses and this mysterious African god, the one who, according to hidden traditions, would have humiliated the great Hebrew liberator, we need to go back in time. Long before biblical accounts were recorded as we know today, there was a living, pulsating, spiritually advanced Africa, an Africa where the sacred was not distant, but part of everything, where the gods did not dwell only the sky, but the rivers, the trees, the winds, and the ancestors. An Africa in which spirituality was the center of civilization, and Egypt was only the tip of the iceberg of an entire continent vibrating in divine energy. Yes, before the Bible, before churches, before translations and doctrines, Africa already knew the invisible, already talked to the eternal. He already revered powerful spiritual forces, some of them with such old names that even the oldest manuscripts could not register accurately. We are not talking about superstitions. We are talking about organized spiritual systems with temples, initiates, complex rituals, and a worldview deeply connected with the spiritual plane. Egypt, for example, was not just a political power. It was a mystical center, a true spiritual vortex where knowledge, magic, science, and faith were inseparable. The Egyptian priests were not just religious. They were astronomers, doctors, architects, mathematicians, and wizards. They knew the functioning of the stars, the secrets of life and death, the cycles of the soul. And it was in this environment, in this profoundly spiritual context, that Moses grew up. The Bible tells us that Moses was found by an Egyptian princess and created as a prince in the Pharaoh palace. But few stop to reflect what it really means. Moses was not just a disguised Hebrew. He was educated as an Egyptian, and more than that, it was started in the mysteries of Egypt. He knew the Egyptian gods, the rituals of the temples, the magic of the scribes, the words of power that the priests used to communicate with the invisible world. He learned the language of symbols, sacred numbers, rites of passage. He knew how the spirit world moved, not from the modern Western perspective, but under the ancient understanding of African. So now imagine someone who knows the deepest mysteries of one of the most powerful spiritual civilizations in history, having a meeting with an entity that comes into a burning bush and says, "I am what I am." What is the power that makes Moses tremble? Who makes a man trained to fear anything back down? Is it really the first time he saw something supernatural? Or did he recognize something that came from before, something so old, so powerful and so forgotten that even he, an initiate, did you know it was better to obey? African traditions speak of spiritual entities that were not linked to human temples. They came from higher dimensions, linked to nature, cosmos, ancestry. These entities did not need to be seen because they manifested by signs, fire, wind, thunder, inner voice, a standard very similar to what is described in the burning bush. But unlike traditional accounts, these beings did not ask for worship. They imposed respect. They revealed truths that they were, but at the same time, they tested the spirit of those who approached. That's why when Moses sees the fire that does not consume, he approaches. But upon hearing the voice, he bows. Because that was not a common phenomenon. This was a manifestation of a higher force, an ancient ancestral consciousness, possibly linked to an African deity prior to Yahweh's own concept as we know it. Here we need to reflect with courage. Why doesn't the Bible detail this episode more clearly? Why doesn't she name the God of the bush at that initial moment? Why only after, over time, does this God be called Yahweh? What's more, why in many other Bible reports God appears with different names, different forms, different voices, different postures? Are we dealing with a single deity or a process of adaptation and fusion of different spiritual entities throughout biblical history? These questions lead us back to Africa, their spiritual plurality, to the deities like Olodumare, Nzambi, Mawulisa, Ra, Amon, who counted the destinies of ancestral black peoples and who carried a knowledge so vast that for many seemed too dangerous to be preserved in the texts that would form Christianity later. Imagine now, Moses, an Egyptian initiate, an African blood Hebrew, receiving a direct order from a God that he might not know from books, but that his spirit recognized. An entity that did not have to prove anything, only manifested, and was enough to transform the course of all the history of the Hebrew people. This is not just symbolic, it is spiritual. It is a call to remember that there are deep truths buried under the sand of time. And that's why Moses' story can't be read just as an isolated episode. It is intertwined with the history of the African continent, with the traditions erased, the scratched names of the sacred books, the spiritual memory that was silenced by institutionalized empires and religions. All of this points to a truth. The God who appeared to Moses may have been an entity prior to the Bible, and after all that religion tried to erase. As we plunge deeper into this line of spiritual timeline, we realized that Egypt was only the gateway to an entire continent where the invisible was part of everyday life, where the African gods were not myths, they were presence. And it was in this sacred soil, in this land where spirituality was lived, taught, and respected that Moses had his awakening. An awakening that is not complete to this day, because the lack of all may be this God who has been erased from history. This is the time for you to look with other eyes, to question what they told you to be absolute truth, understanding that there is a much larger spiritual universe than the Western religion presented, and to realize that perhaps Moses' meeting with the God of the bush was in fact a meeting with an African God who survived time, but was silenced by the scribes. Comment down here if this is opening your mind. He writes, "Now I understand why they erased this God, or I want to know the original African spirituality." Your comment not only helps me know that you are together on this journey, but also helps YouTube understand that this content is relevant and needs to reach more people like you. Let's continue together by unearthing to be buried. There is still much to reveal. The burning bush scene is one of the most enigmatic and powerful of the entire Bible. Many read it superficially like a visual miracle or a divine called metaphor. But those who go spiritually deepen and perceive the hidden details of this experience soon understand that we are facing a much more complex moment and possibly more disturbing than traditional theology dare to admit. There, on that mount, Moses had a meeting with a spiritual force that does not behave like the typical manifestations of the God he would come to know later. That was something different. Something burning without consuming is already a sign. But the voice that comes out of the fire, which orders him to take the sandals, which presents himself so directly and at the same time undefined. This needs to be analyzed in more depth. The question that does not want to silence is, what if that God were not the same as the Hebrews originally worshipped? And if the being who spoke to Moses there in the desert was, in fact, a manifestation of a spiritual entity prior to biblical writings, a powerful African deity known only by initiates of ancient traditions, and that had its identity masked over time? Let's think together. Moses approaches a burning bush. He is not praying, he is not fasting, he is not making a sacrifice. He just sees something out of the normal and is attracted. Biblia says he saw that the bush burned but was not consumed. This is the first breaking of pattern. A fire that does not consume matter. This is not just a miracle, it is a symbol. In the African spiritual tradition, especially in the schools of ancestral wisdom, fire is an element of purification and revelation. And the fire that does not destroy represents a superior divine presence, a spirit that manifests without violating the natural order. Then Moses approaches and hears the voice that says, "Moses, Moses." He replies, "Here I am here." And the voice immediately interrupts him, "Do not approach your sandals from your feet, because the place where you are is holy land." Note, at no point does this God present itself with a known name. He doesn't say, "I'm Yahweh." He does not say, "I am the God of Israel." This only comes later. At this initial moment, what we have is an entity that presents itself by power, presence, not by the name. We live an extremely difficult era in which the prophecies are marked, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. For this, I made my digital book available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first set of comments. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first set of comments to get your copy, because very few things remain and will soon be removed. Do not waste time, click now, and make sure your digital copy. And when Moses, confused and frightened, asks, "What is your name that I tell the people who sent me?" the answer is as ambiguous as deep. I am what I am. In Hebrew, the phrase used is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which many scholars admit to being enigmatic and difficult to translate. It may mean, I am the one who is, I will be the one I will be, or I am the one who causes being. But why such ambiguity? Why is a spiritual being who is about to trust such a gigantic mission to Moses does not reveal his name clearly from the beginning? Now think to me. In almost every ancient cultures, knowing the name of a deity meant having access to part of its power. The names were portals, words of power. Knowing the name of a spirit was like knowing the key that opens its manifestation in the physical plane. And if this entity chose not to reveal the real name at that time, it may be because your name should not be used. Or worse, perhaps because his name was not accepted by the Hebrew people, so he would need to be reinterpreted, adapted, or hidden later by the scribes. And don't forget to get your digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse. It is very important that you buy it quickly before copies are exhausted. Many researchers and spiritual masters state that Ehye Asher Ehye may have been a ciphered way to hide the true name of a powerful African deity linked to creation, time, and spiritual fire, an entity that manifested itself not as a father figure, but as an ancestral cosmic consciousness that did not need temples, laws, or sacrifices, only attention and reverence. Now imagine the impact of this on Moses. He, a man formed in the Egyptian temples, started in hidden mysteries before a spirit that he might not recognize for form, but by energy, by spiritual vibration. Perhaps on some level Moses knew he was not just facing a new call, but in the face of something old, something that preceded the Hebrews themselves, something that carried the same strength of the gods he met in Egypt, but at the same time did not fit into any of the religious forms he had already studied. And that's why he hesitates. This is why he tries to escape the mission, because deep down he knew he was entering a dangerous field. A field where the lines between the known and the forbidden intersect. A field where the name that is not said may be the name that the scribes later made a point of erasing. After all, if Moses received his call from an African god, how would this fit into the theology that was built later? How would this fit the westernized view of a single God revealed only to Israel? Perhaps that is why the name has been replaced. Perhaps Yahweh was a name attributed after this entity to fit it within the narrative that spiritual leaders wanted to build. And isn't it curious that after this episode, the God who speaks to Moses changes Tom? It becomes more nationalist, more legislator, more standard for norms, laws, exclusivity. Unlike that presence of the bush, which only manifests itself, imposes itself and calls, as if there was a fusion between deities or even a subtle replacement that few realized. This interpretation may be uncomfortable for some, but it is precisely the discomfort that moves us to the truth. Because if the name was changed, if the God of the bush was another, if Moses was touched by a deep and forgotten African spirituality, then we have to rethink everything. And that is why this video is so important. We are not here to attack beliefs, but to illuminate the blind spots of the spiritual history of humanity. And this burning scene is undoubtedly a gateway to the best kept mysteries of faith. If you have gotten here and are still with me on this journey, I want to invite you to reflect on me. Does the voice that spoke to Moses in the bush still speaks today? Is this ancestral energy still alive, hoping to be recognized by those who have eyes to see and ears to hear? Comments down here if this possibility sounds with you. He writes, "The bush still burns," or "I want to find out the real name." Its participation strengthens not only this channel, but also this movement of spiritual awakening. We are just starting to unravel the deepest layers of this story, and the next step may be even more revealing. Now that we open our eyes to the possibility that the burning bush has been the stage of a meeting between Moses and a deity prior to Yahweh himself, it's time to go even deeper. We came to the most direct and perhaps more disturbing question of all. Who was, after all, this original African god that the Bible hid? Who was such a powerful, so old entity that caused fear in a man started in the greatest mysteries of Egypt? Who was this spiritual force that did not present itself with a defined name, but whose presence was sufficient to completely transform the life of Moses and alter the course of the history of a people? Before any answer, we need to recognize something essential. Africa is not a pagan land, and it has never been. Contrary to what many have been led to believe, African spiritual traditions are millennial, deeply structured, and endowed with a direct connection with the invisible. In fact, it was these traditions that fueled the basis of many religious systems in the world, including Jewish and the Christian. When we talk about African deities, we are not talking about myths or fables. We are talking about universal spiritual archetypes that, over time, have been forgotten, suppressed, or appropriated by other dominant cultures and religions. One of these names that carries an ancestral weight is Olodumare in the Yoruba spiritual system. Olodumare is not a god among others. It is the supreme principle, the original source, the creator of all that exists. He has no image, no form, does not inhabit temples made by human hands. Olodumare is pure spirit, pure energy, a concept of deity that resonates strongly with the idea of I am what I am, because he is simply, always has been, always will be. Another name that emerges from the waters of oblivion is Nyame, the supreme god of the Akan, a being that rules heavens and creation, and curiously also appears in traditions as a distant, inaccessible presence, which manifests itself only when necessary, just as the entity that appeared to Moses. Nyame, like Olodumare, does not require forced worship, does not impose dogmas, but reveals itself through wisdom, nature, signs. In the tradition of Yewe and Fon, we have Mabulisa, a dual deity that carries the balance between masculine and female, between fire and water, between heaven and earth. And in the solar temples of Egypt, we find the fusion of two spiritual powers, Amon, the hidden, the invisible, and Ra, the visible, the sun, the revealing light. When united, they form the divine totality. And anyone who knows the Egyptian texts knows that Amon-Ra was not a simple god of the pantheon. He was considered the god of the gods, invisible to the human eye, but real, present, active in the spirit world. Now, let's compare. The name is used in ancient scriptures was originally a generic way to refer to any god. El in Hebrew, in fact, can mean both God and power, depending on the context. Over time, this term was used in composed names like El Shaddai, Almighty God, El Elyon, Most High God, until the most specific term, Elohim, began to appear. But beware, Elohim is a plural word. Yes, plural. It literally means the gods. But in modern translations, it was softened to God, as if they were singular. This subtle change carries a gigantic weight, because it shows us that the original biblical texts themselves recognize the existence of multiple spiritual entities. Yahweh, or YHWH, later comes as an attempt to give a proper name to the God of Israel. But until that name, it is wrapped in mystery. For the 4 letters, the sacred tetragram, were not pronounced. The ancients avoided speaking this name aloud precisely because they recognized their power and origin not completely understood. In some traditions, even Yahweh was associated with mountains, storms, fire, elements that are also present in the manifestations of African deities. Now stop and think to me, if Moses had an encounter with an entity that did not identify himself clearly, who came in the form of fire that it did not consume, that imposed silence, reverence, and demanded that he would be stripped of everything before he approached, was he not facing one of these original African deities? Wasn't I am a title, a manifestation, a disguise, something much older than the Hebrew concept of monotheism? And if this deity, known by different names in different African peoples, was simply reinterpreted, fitted, adapted, or even appropriate to build a centralized narrative in Israel, the erasure of this god may have been one of the greatest silences in the spiritual history of humanity. Not out of evil, perhaps, but by strategy. A people need an identity, a symbol, a god who represents him, and often to create this identity, it is necessary to delete what came before. But the spirit cannot be erased. He remains, hoping to be rediscovered. These entities, such as Olodumare, Nyame, Mawu, Amon-Ra, are fragments of a greater truth. They represent the attempt by old people to explain the inexplicable, to translate the invisible. These are manifestations of the same source, seen from different angles. But what catches our attention here is that these manifestations were systematically taken from the official scriptures, not by chance. but because his presence would compromise the centrality of the new God the texts wanted to establish. Many serious scholars admit that there have been additions, adaptations, ideological translations over the centuries. Many names have been exchanged. Many entities were transformed into angels, demons, or simply forgotten. The African spirituality, which once illuminated the world with its wisdom, was reduced to mythology by those who feared its power. But the truth has a curious way to surface, and if you are here listening to this story, feeling something inside you move, maybe it is because part of you always knew there was something beyond, something that the institutional religion could not explain, something that was left out of books but never left the spiritual plane. If this content is messing with you, comments down here, "They have erased, but I want to remember," or "Back, African God." This shows that you are connected, awake, and ready to continue this journey. We still have more hidden truths to reveal, and the next revelation can be one of the most shocking. Now that you have known the possible spiritual identity of the African God, who may have manifested themselves in the bush, we need to look with other eyes for what happened after that. Because if it was really an ancestral, powerful, and forgotten deity that convened Moses, then the following story also needs to be reinterpreted. And here, perhaps, is one of the most distorted passages of the traditional narrative, the famous clash between Moses and the Pharaoh of Egypt. But was it just a political clash? Was it just a dispute between a spiritual leader and an oppressive king? Or was it, in fact, a spiritual battle? And Moses, in this conflict, came out more humiliated than we would like to admit. The Bible describes Moses as God commissioned to free the Hebrew people. But what few say is that, right after his call, Moses doubted. He hesitated. He tried to refuse. He said he couldn't speak well. He asked for help. He asked for signs. He asked for guarantees. This does not seem like the behavior of someone confident, convinced, full of the Spirit. It seems the behavior of someone frightened by the mission they received, someone who saw something so much bigger, so out of their understanding that he would rather escape. And if we think that the entity that called him was not the traditional Yahweh but an ancestral African being who carried centuries of wisdom, then makes sense that Moses has retreated. Because in this case, he knew it would not just be a confrontation with Pharaoh, it would be a direct clash between two spiritual worlds, and the risk of being crushed in this environment was real. When Moses finally accepts the mission and goes to Pharaoh, what happens? He is confronted. He is challenged. Pharaoh asks sarcastically and challenging, "Who is the Lord, that I may hear your voice and let Israel go?" This question carries a huge spiritual weight. Pharaoh is saying, in other words, "I know many gods. I know the names, the rituals, the symbols, but the one you say represent, I do not know. He is not among the powerful who are familiar to me." Here, Pharaoh is exposing a secret. He does not recognize the God of Moses as a fear of fear, which suggests that in the Egyptian spiritual hierarchy, this entity was not even mentioned. This leads us to believe that Moses, even with a divine mission, was spiritually underestimated. The Bible says that the wizards of Egypt replicated the signs of Moses. When he turned the stick into a serpent, the wizards did the same. When he turned the water into blood, the wizards could do it too. When he brought frogs, they also reproduced. That is, what should prove the power of the God of Moses became a demonstration that the Egyptians knew equal or even superior forces. In other words, Moses was challenged in his own field, the spiritual, and there, on that ground, he lost his first round. And it is at this moment that we need to consider a rare but extremely revealing possibility. And if that of, "Did you speak to Moses in the bush?" allowed him to go through this initial humiliation for him to recognize his smallness in the face of divine mystery? What if this God was not just wanting to free a people, but to deconstruct the ego of Moses, who still carried the remnants of a prince of Egypt, proud and conditioned by human power? For when a true deity, an authentic spiritual presence calls us, it does not exalt us. She confronts us. It breaks us. She says goodbye to what we think we are to reveal ourselves, what we are truly. And Moses, in this process, was dismantled spiritually. It is no coincidence that even after seeing such grand signs, he still wavered, still hesitated. I still needed to speak for him, still feared the response of the people. He knew that behind that mission there was something that surpassed him, something that exposed him, something that perhaps not even completely understood. And if we accept that the God who called him was indeed a powerful African spiritual being, then it is natural to understand that Moses, though obedient, was not up to understand or control what had been invoked in that bush. And now let's go a little further. Let's think about the signs. The plagues of Egypt were not just punishments. They were also demonstrations of superior spiritual power. Each plague represented a direct humiliation to the Egyptian deities. But think, if Moses had received this authority directly from Yahweh, as many believe, why did he need to repeat the same message so many times? Why did Pharaoh's heart harden after each plague, even in the face of destruction? Perhaps because, spiritually, Pharaoh was in tune with Egyptian ancestral forces that were not easily intimidated. Or perhaps because the God who acted through Moses did not just want to free the Hebrews, but to show that the true spiritual power came from elsewhere, from an older, wider, and more forgotten source than anyone daring to imagine. In various African cultures, the true priest is not one who has all the answers. It is the one who was humiliated, broken, proved by the invisible. Moses went through this. And if the African God who called him was really who we thought, then this initial humiliation was purposeful. It was spiritual. It was transformative. It was part of a process that would make Moses not just a liberator, but an instrument of something much larger than himself. And now I ask you with all spiritual sincerity, do you think Moses was humiliated by Pharaoh or by God? Do you think all this was just a theater to strengthen your faith, or a mirror of what happens to everyone who is chosen by a superior spiritual force? If this reflection has touched you, comments down here. I recognize the God who humiliates to transform, or now I understand why Moses retreated. This helps me to know that you are spiritually connected with this journey. And more than that, strengthens this message to get it to those who need it. Revelation is still just beginning, and the next step will bring something even stronger. After Moses is spiritually challenged by Pharaoh and confronted with his own fears, doubts, and limitations, what is expected of Scripture is a clear explanation, a light that reveals precisely who this entity was so powerful that it had sent him, where it was its nature, its origin, its full way of acting. But what we find, in fact, is a silence that bothers you, a void that is not casual but surgically placed, a silence that hides, a silence that protects something or someone. This silence appears in various parts of the Bible, and it is not simple omissions due to lack of historical details. It is a pattern of selective erasure, spiritual layers hidden behind human translations, editions, and decisions that have shaped what many now consider sacred. What has been removed? What was softened? And especially why so much effort to erase certain truths? To begin to understand this mystery, we need to recognize that the Bible we have at hand today is not exactly the same that existed in the early centuries. She underwent councils, translations, political reinterpretations, religious impositions. Many texts were considered too dangerous to remain. Others were called heretics. And others were simply set aside because they did not align with the central narrative that was being built. This alone reveals a lot. There are passages in the Scriptures that carry clear signs that there have been additions. There are verses that interrupt themselves abruptly, stories that seem to start from the environment, and especially references to other books that are no longer in the biblical canon. Have you noticed how in various parts of the Bible she herself quotes books that do not exist? The book of Wars of the Lord, Jazza's book, the book of Enoch, the book of the Jubilees, the writings of the prophets who are not listed among the prophets. Is this all just coincidence, or is it a sign that something was left out? Enoch's book, for example, is one of the most intriguing keys to this issue. In it, we find descriptions of meetings with heavenly beings who do not fit in traditional theology. Enoch talks about the vigilantes, the fallen angels, the spheres of heaven, and a much more complex spiritual worldview than the Bible summarizes. But what few realize is that Enoch also talks about an ancestral wisdom that was corrupted and that men tried to hide. Why was this book taken from the official Bible, even being quoted by Judas in the New Testament? What was that dangerous in it? Perhaps because he showed a direct line between the ancient gods and men, and this would mess up the entire hierarchical structure that was tried to establish later. In the manuscripts of Nag Hammadi, discovered in Egypt in 1945, we find other texts that speak of hidden deities, spiritual beings who acted in the name of light but have been replaced by others who disguise themselves with gods. One of the most impactful texts, the hypostasis of the Archontes, suggests that there are entities that have been passed through God, confusing humanity and establishing a control system. Now think, what if the true African God who appeared to Moses was one of those who was replaced? What if the silence of the scriptures was the way of ensuring that their name was no longer remembered, that your story went out, that your image was confused with something smaller? There are excerpts in the Old Testament where God acts extremely differently from the one that appears in the burning bush. At times, he looks fair, wise, peaceful. In others, choleric, vengeful, destructive. This raises a spiritual suspicion. Are we dealing with the same entity all the time, or was there a gradual, imperceptible but real replacement that shaped a more convenient God to the religious and political system being created? The absence of certain African spiritual names in Scripture is also revealing. How is it possible that Egypt is such a powerful civilization, its spiritual cosmology hardly appears in the Bible directly? How is it possible that known deities throughout ancient Africa simply disappear from sacred records, even though he has historically lived with the Hebrews? The answer, however uncomfortable, may be precisely in this silence. A silence imposed, a silence with purpose. Because when you try to unify a faith, create a religious identity, you need to choose a central God. And for that, others need to disappear. It's not that they ceased to exist, they were hidden, deleted, silenced. But if the Bible speaks of excerpts of other gods, if God says, "You will not have other gods before me," then who were these others? Would they only be inventions of the pagan peoples? Or would they be real deities with power and wisdom that were banned from official history because they threatened the centralized spiritual rule? This silence is so powerful that it extends to this day. Even within the churches, there are themes that are avoided, names that are not cited, questions that cannot be asked. But deep down, many feel that there is something missing, an echo of a name that was forgotten, an intuition that the God of the bush was not the same as being worshipped later in the golden altars of the institutions. A feeling that true spiritual power is beyond the letter, beyond tradition, beyond religion. And this silence speaks. He calls for attentive listeners, for awakened minds, for brave hearts enough to seek what was hidden. He shouts between the lines of Scripture, in the books that are no longer there, in the stories that were halved. He invites us to look again with other eyes. Not to abandon faith, but to rediscover the source, the origin, the deity that was erased, but never destroyed. If this is messing with you, if this silence makes you want to hear more, comment below. I hear the silence of Scripture, or I want to find out the erased books. Write what you felt listening to this, because when you comment, you not only strengthen this channel, You awaken others that, just like you, know that there is something beyond what was written. And the journey continues. So far, we open cracks where the light of truth begins to enter. We already feel the weight of the silence of the scriptures, the tracks left by the forgotten books, the echoes of the deities that were erased over time. But now we need to play in a newer, closer, and even more delicate wound, the process of spiritual colonization. A subtle, violent, deep movement that not only distorted faith, but destroyed bridges millennial between African peoples and the original spirit world. We are not just talking about wars, slavery, and territorial exploitation. We are talking about the manipulation of consciousness, of the amputation of the soul of an entire people. From a silent operation that planted guilt, fear, and shame where there was once connection, reverence, and power. It is impossible to talk about African spirituality without recognizing how intentionally discredited, demonized, and replaced by institutionalized religious systems was intentionally discredited. Integer peoples with deep spiritual strains were forced to deny the names of their own gods, abandon their rites, burn their sacred objects, bury their stories, and swallow a foreign faith under the threat of the cross and the sword. The only God did not come as revelation. He was imposed as a weapon, as a symbol of power, as a seal of obedience. It was not spiritual freedom, but mental and cultural rule. During European colonization, missionaries were not just converting souls. They came to install a new spiritual pattern, a new sacred alphabet, a new way of praying, thinking, believing. And the most cruel is that many of these impositions were made based on a version of the already manipulated, edited Bible, emptied of its ancestral roots. African spirituality, with its millennial practices, was called witchcraft. Their priests treated as witches, their entities labeled as demons, their rituals confused with sin. But all this was part of an accurate engineering, disconnect Africans from their original power source, because those who dominate spiritually dominate culturally. Those who decide how you connect with the divine also decide how you see yourself in the world, and that is exactly what was done. The African god who spoke to the elders, who manifested himself in the elements, which was invoked with drums, dances, and sacred words in living tongues. This god was buried by a new god who did not look like you, who demanded silence, fear, and guilt. A god who asked you to kneel and forget what your ancestors knew. And so began a deep process of invisible spiritual slavery. The consequence of this is that today many still live under this shadow. Many repeat doctrines that have been implemented for centuries of oppression, not knowing that they are practicing a faith adapted to domesticate, not to release. Many pray to a God who never recognized them, as they embarrass the names their grandparents pronounced reverence. Many read the scriptures without knowing that inside were traces of their own spiritual past, traces that were torn, buried, and replaced. And why was that done? Because a people connected to their original spirituality is not manipulable. A people who honor their ancestors, who listen to the signs of nature, who understands the power of the word and energy, does not need dogmas imposed. He is free. And the modern world does not know how to deal with free people. Therefore, it was necessary to create a new spiritual paradigm where there is only one God and everything outside it is considered error. But they did not tell you that this only God was modeled, redesigned, rebuilt with European traits, with political ideals, with power structures that served more to the empires than to the spirit. Moses, which we saw possibly touched by an ancestral African god, had his encounter reinterpreted. The bush became a generic symbol. The fire has lost the mystery. The name was changed, and the call turned only one episode. But what if what Moses lived were, in fact, a connection with the purest, more powerful, more direct African spirituality? What if what he saw was the essence they today call Olodumare, Nyame, Mawu, or Amon-Ra? What if he was just one of many who saw but had his experience rewritten to fit into the theology of the one God? This only God that spiritual colonization imposed was not built to release, but to control. He was sold as absolute truth, but hid a story full of cuts, censorship, and manipulation. He does not invite you to self-knowledge. He teaches you to fear. It does not connect with the earth, with the elements, with the ancestors. It isolates you, puts you in cold temples, tells you that there is only one way, and that everything else is darkness. But what if the light is just where they told you it was darkness? Many today are awakening. Many are listening to the drums that speak to the spirit again. They are rescuing names, languages, stories. They are feeling again the presence of the African God who never left. He was just silent. And this movement is not rebellion. It is healing. It is reconnecting. It is return to the source. Spiritual colonization could not kill the ancestral spirit. She may have buried, but it has not destroyed. And now, with every person who awakens, with every revealed truth, this deity with measure to resurface. Not with impositions, but with love. Not with wars, but with conscience. And it is up to each of us to decide if we will continue to be attached to an imported faith, or if we will listen to the voice that echoed in the mountains before there were temples and doctrines. If this makes sense to you, if this call touches your soul, comment below. I want to break free from spiritual colonization, or I am hearing the voice of the ancestral God. These words are not just comments. They are spiritual statements. These are keys who open their way to others who are still silent. And as always, this is just another step, because the next revelation can be the one that was missing for everything to fit. This time of the journey is no longer possible to deny. There is something that was hidden, silenced, and rewritten. The feeling that the story that told us about Moses, about God, about the roots of spirituality is incomplete. It is no longer just intuition. It begins to be sustained by traces, marks, fragments, left in places that few dare to look. And now, the time has come to put our feet on the ground of historical and textual reality, to look beyond faith and face concrete evidence, the findings that show that there were other services, other sacred names, other gods, prior to Yahweh. When we talk about spiritual archaeology, we are talking about a search that goes far beyond ancient ruins. We are talking about a tracking of the sacred footprints on earth, and one of these footprints appears in the older inscriptions known in the territory of Canaan and ancient Egypt. In several tombs, stelae, temples, and Egyptian monuments, the name of deities, prior to any biblical reference, was already carved in stone. The worship of Ammon, the presence of Ptah, Sekhmet, Ma'at, gods who represented cosmic and spiritual principles, not just mythological figures. These names were not idols to the ancients. They were real forces, revered with fear and wisdom. Even in many of these registrations, there are clear records that Egyptian kings not only worshipped these gods, but also consulted them before making important decisions. This shows that there was a living, direct, active spiritual relationship there. And we cannot ignore that Moses grew up in this environment, which was educated inside the house of Pharaoh, surrounded by this spiritual worldview. He knew who these gods were. He saw his temples. He heard his names. He witnessed his rituals. So when a god manifests himself to him in a bush, in the form of fire, it is natural that Moses felt that he was facing something familiar but veiled. And when we turn our eyes to the ancient texts, not just canonics, but the parallels, the apocrypha, the forgotten, we find even more tracks of a faded spirituality. In Ugaritic records found in the ancient city of Ugarit, present-day Syria, names like El and Elohim come long before the consolidation of Hebrew monotheism. El was the name of a supreme Canaanite god, the father of the gods, a figure who ruled the heavens and the fate of men. Already, Elohim appears in the plural as a divine council, a set of superior spiritual beings. These records date centuries before Torah was written and show that the Hebrews at first were deeply inserted into a world where divine plurality was norm, not deviation. There are also traces in Egyptian documents that speak of a people named Shau de Yhw, which many scholars interpret as the first record of the name Yahweh outside the Bible. Interestingly, this YHW appears linked to a mountainous southern region, which reinforces the idea that Yahweh was originally a tribal god, associated with a local deity, not with the universal creative God. This alone already shakes the foundations of the traditional narrative, because it shows that Yahweh may have been just one of many, a God who was chosen, high, and adapted as Israel's identity was built. Another curious fact is the total absence of references to Yahweh in Egyptian or Mesopotamian historical records during the period when he supposedly should be acting with great power in the plagues of Egypt and the Exodus. How is it possible that no Egyptian scribe recorded the destruction of his empire by a foreign god? How did no Egyptian king even have a story, a mention, a text fragment that spoke on the pests or the escape of thousands of slaves? This raises an uncomfortable hypothesis. Either this story was completely spiritualized and disconnected from the real historical context, or it wasn't exactly as they told us. Some European missionaries of the 18th and 19th centuries reported that upon arriving in certain regions of Africa, they found tribes who worshipped a single, invisible creator of everything, with attributes similar to the biblical God, but they had never had contact with Christianity. Not only does this reinforce the thesis of an ancestral African spirituality, but also shows that the idea of monotheism was not the invention of the West. It already existed, more organic and freely, long before religious colonization. And these reports were set aside, shelved, because they did not serve the narrative that Africans needed to be evangelized. If we look closely at the ancient spiritual maps, we will see that the route where Moses walked was going through regions where the cult of solar deities was common. And it is no wonder that the manifestation in the bus is through fire, the same element that symbolizes the sun, the light, the divine presence in various cultures. In some traditions, fire does not consume because it represents the spiritual truth that illuminates without destroying. This is exactly the opposite of the punitive and rigid view that the institutionalized God has come to represent. Texts like Mari, Abla, and the Armana files also bring lists of gods and spiritual practices that are now ignored by traditional Bible studies. But the truth is that these records were there all the time, waiting for someone who wanted to see. And now that we look at them with more awake eyes, they begin to tell a new version of the facts. A version that includes Africa, a version that recognizes the erasure, a version that brings back the silenced names. Do you now realize why it is so important to revisit these evidence? They are not by chance. They are loose pieces of a great spiritual puzzle. And perhaps the truth about the God who appeared to Moses, this God who was forgotten, hidden, replaced, is just what they tried to make us ignore. Because the history of faith is not linear. She was shaped, and it is up to us now to undo the layers and return to essence. If you felt that any of these evidence has moved something inside you, write here in the comments, "I see the marks of hidden history," or "Egypt and Canaan still speak." Leave your vision, your perception, your question. Each comment strengthens this collective spiritual investigation we are doing here. And what comes next will take us even deeper. Now we put together historical fragments, spiritual traces, and textual marks of an intentionally erased past. There is an inevitable, urgent, and deeply personal question. What does all this mean to us today? What is the real and direct impact of this concealment, this silent replacement of the African God in Scripture, in modern spirituality, especially in the lives of millions of Africans and African descendants around the world? The answer, for those who have spiritual sensitivity, is clear. It means everything, because this concealment was not just a theological maneuver or a cultural adaptation of ancient beliefs. It was, above all, a blow against the spiritual identity of a people who, when torn from their land, was also torn from their spiritual memory. A people who have been taught to doubt their own ancestors, their own rights, their own gods, and that still carries, often unconsciously, this disconnection as if it were natural. But it is not. This spiritual disconnection is like an open wound in the soul. It manifests itself in subtle and painful ways, in the difficulty of feeling belonging, in the feeling of praying to a distant God, with face and language that do not reflect their own ancestry, in the internalized shame of traditions that were demonized for centuries. Millions grew up learning that his spiritual heritage was wrong, that his ancestors were lost, that salvation would only come through a foreign, adapted faith, shaped on another continent, with another culture, another language, another energy. And now, as we rediscover the roots of the African God who was erased, the one who may have spoken with Moses in the burning bush, the one who manifested without temples, without dogmas, only with presence, we are recovering much more than information. We are recovering spiritual dignity, and this is revolutionary. Think for a moment on how the spiritual life of millions would be different if they knew early on that their people were already walking with God long before colonization. That the only God has not been introduced by force, but recognized by his ancestors through nature, cycles, elements, dreams, intuition. That the names like Olodumare, Nyame, Amora, or Mawu were not smaller gods, but expressions of the same creative source, seen in other forms, in other languages, but with the same divine breath. It changes everything. It changes the way of praying. It changes the way you see yourself, changes the way of living faith. Because faith, when rooted in history itself, heals the soul from the inside out. And perhaps this is the greatest theft of all time. They made us believe that to be spiritual, we needed to cut our roots. In fact, the more we return to our roots, the closer we come from the divine presence. Imagine a black child growing up knowing that his ancestors talked to God under the stars, that his color was not a curse, but a symbol of fertile earth, of the night full of mystery and revelation. Imagine this child learning that his spirituality was not born in the pain of slavery, but in the millennial wisdom of civilizations that understood the invisible even before the first stones of the temples were based. This is why this revelation matters so much, because it does not only concern the past, it shapes the present and frees the future. She takes faith out of the field of oppression and replaces her in the place of consciousness, strength, identity. It heals the colonized mind, who still thinks that God can only manifest himself in a specific format, with a specific language, with a specific skin. It gives us the right to find God within us, not just in books that, however sacred, have gone through the hands and interests of men. This spiritual rediscovery is also a call to action, a call to revisit everything we learn, not with revolt, but with discernment. A call to hear the drums, the stories of the elders, the songs that crossed oceans in the slave basements but did not shut up. A call to look at each other in the mirror and see not only the reflection of survival, but the brightness of the spiritual inheritance that has never been lost, just dormant. And here, at this point in the video, you may be feeling something difficult to explain. A heat in the chest, a memory you have never lived, but it seems old. I miss something you didn't know you had lost. This is the spirit moving. This is the memory of your soul being activated. This is the African God, the God of his ancestors, saying, I never left. You are the one who forgot my name. So what does all this mean to us today? It means it's time to remember, to rebuild, to resume, not to accept a second-hand, dehydrated and standardized faith, but to drink from the original source. It means that you no longer need to choose between your ancestry and spirituality, because they have never been in conflict. This was an illusion created to divide you internally. True faith does not separate, it unites. And if you understand this, if something inside you was touched by this truth, leave it here in the comments. I am recovering my ancestral spirituality, or my faith has color, history and root. Comment with the heart. Write what you felt. Because this video is not just about history, it is about healing, it is about reconnection. And the next part will further deepen this way back to what was forgotten. Because when you remember who you are, the spirit world opens again. Now we go through so many layers of concealment, erasing, manipulation and rediscovered, we reach the point where history finds the spirit. Because in the end, everything that has been hidden, all that has been silenced, all that has been distorted, it was done with one purpose, to break your direct connection with the divine that dwells in you and your ancestors. But you are here, and that alone is already a sign. Something in you resonated with this search. Something in you responded to the call. And now the time has come to look inside more courageously than ever and ask the question that changes everything. Is the God you love really who you think is? This question for many may seem offensive, but to the awake, to the sensitive ones, to those who feel in the spirit that there is something beyond what was taught, this question is liberating. Because when you dare to question the origin of your faith, you are not rejecting God. You are seeking to rediscover him in its purest form, before interference, before institutions, before the doctrines built for control. And this journey of reunion is actually a journey of return to yourself. Think about it. From an early age, they taught you to pray with words that were not yours, seeking a God with foreign face and accent, to kneel before images and ideas that did not represent you. They told you that their blood carried a curse, that their color was a consequence of disobedience, that their history began in the pain of slavery. But they did not tell you that long before that, their ancestors danced with the divine under the full moon, guided by drums that pulsed at the same rhythm as the heart of God. They did not tell you that there was wisdom, revelation, healing, and spiritual power in their people, even before the first European missionary landing with their Bible in hand. And now that you begin to remember that you begin to feel that there is a spiritual thread pulling you back, the question becomes inevitable. Is the God who taught you fear is the same God who created you with so much love? Does the God who sent you worship in silence and guilt is the same that blew the secrets of the universe in the ears of the African elders without the need for an altar, pulpit or temple? Is the name you pronounce with devotion is the real name, or just the name that was left? This is not about denying your faith. Quite the contrary, it is about purifying it, to undress your spirituality of all that was placed on it, because true faith does not imprison it. It frees it, and there is no spiritual freedom without reconnecting with their roots. It is time to remember that your faith may have color, may have ancestry, may have a drum, may have land in your feet, incense in smoke, and truth in your eyes. This is why many today, even frequenting temples, even reading the Bible, even praying with sincerity, they still feel empty. It is not a lack of faith. It is a lack of connection with the original source. The soul feels, the body knows, the spirit calls. There is a spiritual longing that is not explained, only lives. And this longing is not from heaven. It is from the root. It is from the sacred womb, where the divine was felt with his feet on the ground, his eyes closed, his chest open. It is from the time when the sunrise was looked at and it was understood that God was speaking there, even before any scripture. This truth doesn't have to be imposed because it is already inside you. She just needs to be remembered. It needs to be called by name. And the name can be Olodumare, it can be love, it can be Mawu, it can be the sound that comes out when you sigh relieved when feeling the divine presence within you. Ancestral spirituality is not limited to what has been recorded. It lives on what is meaningful, and maybe that's why so many sacred texts were erased, because the system knew that if you remember who it is, no one would control you anymore. Your faith is more than you think. It did not start with baptism, nor with the first worship, nor with the decorated verse. She began when the first of her ancestors looked at the sky, closed her eyes, felt the wind, and understood that there was something bigger there, something I called, which guided, that protected, and that something has color, has name, it has beat, it has rhythm. It was not invented, it was lived, and it's alive inside you. That's why right now you may need to be silent, take a deep breath, close your eyes, and ask yourself, do I really know the God I follow, or just follow the God who gave me? Be honest with you. Don't be afraid of the answer, because any path that leads you back to its essence is sacred. Any path that reconnects you with the Creator through your ancestors returns you what was taken without your permission. And if you are feeling this message play something deep inside you, this is already a sign that reconnection has begun. It may seem subtle now, but it's like a seed that germinates in silence, and when you least expect it, it sprouts hard. You begin to see faith with other eyes. It begins to perceive God in the details that once went unnoticed. It begins to dream of old symbols. It begins to be thrilled to hear chants that do not understand rationally, but that your soul recognizes. This is the power of spiritual memory. And she's awakening to you now. You don't have to abandon everything you have learned, but it needs to allow your spirituality to go beyond the frames. You need to let the Spirit blow wherever it wants, even within its own history, because the God who dwells in you may have been waiting for a long time that you will call you by the name he has heard when he created you. If you really felt this, comment below, I want to remember who my ancestral God is, or my faith goes beyond what they taught me. Write what touched your soul. Share what you felt. Each comment here is not just engagement, it is a spiritual statement. It is the echo of the collective awakening. And get ready, because the next part will reveal something even deeper, and you won't want to stop now. If you stayed here, it's because something inside you has been played. This journey was not light. It was intense, provocative, and full of spiritual revelations that challenge everything they taught us. And if this content has made sense to you, then you are part of a rare group of people who are looking to awaken, reconnect, remember who it really is. So you are now subscribed to the channel, so you don't lose any continuation of this series of hidden truths that are yet to come. And for me to know that you stayed until the end, comment below, "The truth found me." These words show that you not only watched, but you were played spiritually by this message. I read all the comments, and the most engaged always receive answers and special attention. Oh, and don't forget to leave. It helps this content to reach more people than you are ready to wake up. And now, click on the video that is appearing on the screen, because it is the direct continuation of this revelation, and what you will see below can change everything you still think about faith, spirituality, and ancestry. I see you there.